first arrived in India, I went to the Himalayas, and I took on the life of a sadhu, wearing sadhu robes. I had a little begging pot, and I was traveling through the jungles and the mountains of Himalayas, and meeting many great rishis, yogis, sages, living at their ashrams, learning from them. I was also living sometimes in caves with yogis in the jungles. Sometimes I was living in caves in seclusion myself, just practicing various meditations. I lived at Buddhist monasteries, studying Buddhism under Rinpoches and Lamas. And in this way I was traveling around India, looking for God realization. Each place, everyone wanted to initiate me, because to have a foreign disciple was very prestigious for yogis, gurus, lamas, rinpoches, and all of these other spiritual personalities. But I had felt in my heart that until I find a guru who I am convinced I will never leave for my whole life, I cannot accept initiation. So I was learning, and I was very favorable wherever I learned, and traveling. And at one point I came to Bombay. I went there in order to try to get a renewal on my visa. So one day I was walking down the street in Bombay, and I saw a big, big sign, and it said Hare Krishna Festival. And under it said, at Cross Maidan. So I asked someone, where is this Cross Maidan? And they told me where. So I went, and there was a big, big pandal, and many devotees. And they told me that their Guru Maharaj was going to be speaking that night. So I stayed there and talked with devotees. I was reading Prabhupada's books during the day. And then Srila Prabhupada and all the devotees went on the stage. And there was thousands and thousands of people. There must have been 10, 15,000 people, maybe more. And I was a very insignificant sadhu. I had matted hair, a begging pot, river-stained clothes, and I was way in the back of this massive crowd. And the devotees were chanting on stage, having kirtan, and Prabhupada was in the middle of the stage, sitting on a vyasasana. And one devotee, Guru Das, he came all the way through all the crowds, and he came to me, and he took me by the hand, and he said, Srila Prabhupada wants you to sit beside him. I said, how does Srila Prabhupada know me? And Guru Das didn't say anything. He just said, he wants you to sit beside him. So we went through all these thousands and thousands of people, and I came up on the stage, and Srila Prabhupada looked at me, and he smiled, and he went like this, that you sit here. So I came and I sat just a few feet away from his vyasasana. And there was a beautiful kirtan. I remember Madhudvista Swami was leading the kirtan, and all the devotees had clean-shaved heads, beautiful, clean dhotis and saris. And I had these river-stained sadhu clothes with holes in them, and matted hair down practically to my waist. I was a sadhu, at least trying to be. And I was just thinking, why has he called me here? I'm not a good image for how he appears with all of his devotees. But he smiled upon me very graciously and encouraged me. And then he gave his lecture. And after the lecture, he started to walk to the stairs going down from the stage. And as he walked by me, I went to touch his feet. Because traditionally, as I was taught, you're supposed to touch a holy man's feet and place the dust upon your head. So when I reached out to touch his feet, one of his very senior disciples chastised me. He yelled at me. He said, no one is allowed to touch Srila Prabhupada's feet. So being very embarrassed, I pulled my hand back. And Prabhupada looked at me, and he smiled. And then he gave me the first instruction he ever gave me in my life. He said, you can touch my feet. So I reached and touched his lotus feet and placed the dust on my head. And then he smiled very mercifully and told me, "You come and sit here every night." I had known already so many of the residents of Vrindavan, and they told me that Swami Bhaktivedanta is living at Sharaf Bhavan, one very wealthy man's house, with his disciples. So I went there to meet Srila Prabhupada. And when I arrived, it was the early morning, and Srila Prabhupada was giving Srimad Bhagavatam class. And I remember he was chanting Jai Radha Madhava. And as he was chanting, I was appreciating like I had never appreciated anything in my whole life. I was thinking that the gravity, the intensity of the devotion in which he was chanting Krishna's names, I had never seen anywhere. I had met so many of the greatest yogis, the greatest gurus of the Himalayas, many great Christian saints, Muslim saints. For 6 months I was traveling through Vrindavan, meeting all of the Babajis, so many of his god brothers, so many of the very famous Brijavasi saints. But I had never seen such a depth of love and compassion in Srila Prabhupada as he was chanting Radha Madhava. My heart completely transformed. And then he gave his lecture. And when he spoke, every question I ever had was answered in one lecture. He spoke in such a way that everything I had ever learned in every religion I felt was included within his message, plus something far more that was sublime. And it was at that time, sitting at his feet in Vrindavan, that in my heart I accepted this as my spiritual master, and I must surrender my life to him. And then Srila Prabhupada every day would take us on parikrama to many of the holy places. He took us to Govardhan and Badarsana and Nandagaon. He took us to the various places in Vrindavan, Radha Damodar Temple, Radha Govindaji Temple. And I remember especially one day he took us to Mahavan, Gokul, and he took us to Brahmandagat. And Brahmandagat is the place where Krishna was accused of eating dirt, and then he opened his mouth and Mother Yashoda saw the universe. I remember Srila Prabhupada so animately telling that story right at the place. He was telling the stories wherever he would take us. And then he told us to take bath in the Jamuna. So all the devotees were inviting Prabhupada to also take bath in Jamuna. But Srila Prabhupada said, "Today I am very sick and I cannot take baths, but you all go and enjoy a nice bath in Jamuna." So all the devotees were in Jamuna and he was on the steps, quite high over the river. And he was just watching all the devotees enjoying the wonderful ambrosial waters of Jamuna. And he was just smiling, looking at us. And he became so ecstatic just to see all the devotees bathing that he very quickly got up and took off his clothes and put on gamsha and came down to take bath with us in Jamuna. And devotees were very ecstatic, very happy. Everyone was gathered around him, and devotees were even bathing him like an abhishek with Jamuna water. And Srila Prabhupada was just very happy to be bathing in the Jamuna along with his disciples in the holy land of Vrindavan. After the parikrama, in the morning every day, devotees would take prasad, and then Srila Prabhupada would have darshan in his room and meet his old friends from Vrindavan, his god brothers, and so many others. And I used to just sit there all afternoon with him and just watch him talking with his old Brijavasi friends. And there was a rule that devotees were not supposed to be there, because in the afternoon the devotees were supposed to do seva, doing Harinam, Sankirtan, and other services. So I would sit there, and one day the regional manager of ISKCON for India at the time, he saw me sitting there with Srila Prabhupada. And at that time it was just Prabhupada and myself in the room. And he said to me that no devotees are allowed to sit with Prabhupada during his darshan time. And I looked at Prabhupada Prabhupada looked at me, and then I said to this devotee, I said, but I'm not a devotee. Then I pointed to my matted hair. And then he looked at Prabhupada, and Prabhupada smiled, and then he left, and I got to stay with Prabhupada. And I remember it was so beautiful seeing Prabhupada meet his old friends, especially Krishnadas Babaji. That was a beautiful sight. Krishnadas Babaji came to see Prabhupada. I remember actually I met him on the street and I told him that Prabhupada was here. So he said, take me. So I brought him. And while I was trying to bring him up the stairs to Prabhupada's room, one sannyasi disciple told him he wasn't allowed to come. He was actually ready to physically throw him out. I said, please ask Prabhupada if he wants to see him. And he went up and asked, and then he said, yes, he wants to see you. So he came into the room, and when Srila Prabhupada met him, Prabhupada was talking to a whole group of about 15 people. When Krishnadas Babaji Maharaj came into the room, Prabhupada's eyes just became filled with tears, and Krishnadas Babaji Maharaj's eyes became full of tears. And Prabhupada stood up, and Babaji Maharaj called out, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. And Prabhupada practically ran to him and embraced him. And as they were embracing, they were just so affectionate. I had never seen in my entire life such affectionate and love between two people as Prabhupada was embracing his godbrother. And then Prabhupada took him with his arms around him to the seat where he would sit behind a little table. And they were both sitting together on this seat. And they had their arms around each other, and they were talking in Bengali. And as they were talking, I couldn't understand, but Prabhupada was laughing so hard. Krishnadas Babaji kept saying these things, and Prabhupada was just laughing and laughing and laughing. And every now and then they would slap each other on the legs. They were practically sitting on top of each other. And there was tears in their eyes. They were just so happy to be together, discussing transcendental subject matters. And it was amazing because all these people in the room, Krishnadas Babaji Maharaj and Srila Prabhupada, were completely oblivious to everyone. They were just in their own world, hearing and chanting the glories of the Lord together. The devotees thought that I should join the movement. They told me that Srila Prabhupada was going to be taking them to different places in India, and that I should join them. And I explained that I have already made a decision that I'm never going to leave Vrindavan for my whole life. So they became very critical of me. They were calling me a Sahajya. They were calling me a Smarta Brahman. They were saying I was bogus. They were saying that Lord Chaitanya's movement is to preach. And I was thinking that they do not understand. These Western people, they do not understand what is Vrindavan. They even offered me to be Srila Prabhupada's personal servant, because they said that they were always getting sick in India, but I was very much accustomed to living in India. But I told them that, thank you very much for this wonderful offer, but I will serve Srila Prabhupada when he does something in Vrindavan. And they were very much criticizing me. In fact, they were harassing me. So one day, Srila Prabhupada gave a lecture in a garden. And as he was walking out from the lecture to his car, I had just arrived. And there was crowds of people between his car and where he spoke. And they were all just bowing down to him as he was walking by. So I was one of those people in the crowd. And I bowed down just as Srila Prabhupada was walking by me. And then I got up. And when I got up, Srila Prabhupada was stopped right in front of me. So I looked up at him. I was on my knees. And Srila Prabhupada had a very serious expression on his face, very concerned. and he looked at me right in the eyes. And when he looked in my eyes, I could feel that he was looking right into my soul. I could actually feel my soul being touched by Srila Prabhupada's glance. I had never had a sensation like that in my entire life. And then Srila Prabhupada asked me, how long have you been living in Vrindavan? And I was thinking, oh no, all the devotees have been chastising me. Now Srila Prabhupada's going to chastise me. So very shy, I said, Srila Prabhupada, I've been here about 6 months. And Prabhupada just stood silently, just looking at me, penetrating me with his glance. It seemed like hours. Perhaps it was about 30 seconds. And then his face blossomed into the most beautiful, ecstatic smile. And he said to me, very nice. Vrindavan is the most wonderful place. And then he rubbed me on the head and he walked by. And I was thinking at that time that everyone was chastising me for being in Vrindavan. But Prabhupada knew just what I had to hear to become attached to him. At that time I knew I was wrong, and I was ready to go anywhere and do anything for him, because I felt such a love, such an understanding, such a depth of he was willing to say whatever was required to encourage me to become more attached to him and more attached to devotional service. One day he was giving Srimad Bhagavatam class, and I remember he was saying that you are all distributing my books, but my question is, are you reading my books? He said, if you go up to someone and try to convince them to buy the books, what happens if that person asks you, do you read these books? What is it about? And you tell him, I don't read these books, I only sell these books. He said, how will you convince them? Unless you are convinced of the subject matter of these books by reading them carefully, how will you convince others to buy them? He was very strong, telling all the book distributors that they have to very carefully read his books. After Srila Prabhupada left, it was announced that in August he would be coming to New Vrindavan for a special Bhagavad-Dharma discourse, where he would be speaking on a mountain and discussing Srimad Bhagavatam. And also he was going to celebrate Janmashtami and Vyas Puja in New Vrindavan. So they were recruiting people to help to prepare. So I was thinking that I will go to New Vrindavan to help prepare for Srila Prabhupada's arrival, then I will go back to Vrindavan, India. So I went to New Vrindavan. And there was great, great enthusiasm to prepare everything for Prabhupada's coming. There was a house called Madhuban, and it was an old, beaten-up house, and they wanted to renovate it. So I was helping with the painting and renovations. The day before Srila Prabhupada was coming, actually it was at night, he was coming the next morning, they discovered that the toilet didn't work. So everyone wanted to take rest, and I was told to fix the toilet. I had never fixed a toilet in my life. I was just pushing things in the toilet. I don't know what I was doing, but I was just doing anything to try to get it to flush, because it wouldn't flush. Finally, I was up all night. Just when Srila Prabhupada was arriving, I pushed the lever and it flushed. And I was thinking, Prabhupada's going to be so happy. He has a toilet that will flush. So then Srila Prabhupada came to the Madhuban house. And he went in, and I was just feeling so proud that I have made his toilet so it flushes. And when it was time for Srila Prabhupada to go to the toilet, the devotees led him and said, this is a very nice toilet, it works very nicely. And Prabhupada took his little lota and he went out into the field. And he responded to nature in the field. And then he took his bath in the field. And he said that I enjoy responding to nature in the nice fresh breezes in the grass. So the whole time Srila Prabhupada was there, he went out to the field to respond to nature every time. He never used the toilet. So I got a lesson. Srila Prabhupada was teaching me a lesson of detachment. We should be willing to give anything and everything to please our Guru, but we cannot be attached to the results. And Srila Prabhupada every day was being brought on a palanquin to the top of a mountain where there was a beautiful pavilion that was made just for Srila Prabhupada's discourses. Devotees worked very hard to make it for Prabhupada, and there was a wonderful stage and wonderful Vyasasan. And hundreds of devotees and guests came from all over America for this Bhagavad Dharma discourse. The first day he was brought up on a palanquin. The devotees spent weeks making this palanquin for Prabhupada. When it was time for him to get up, they couldn't find the palanquin. Finally, Prabhupada was just waiting and waiting and waiting, and then they found the palanquin, and they brought him up. And afterward, Prabhupada, devotees worked so hard, and they had a whole procession of kirtan up this mountain, and it was so uncomfortable for him. So when he got to the top, he said, "Isn't there a car that can drive me up here?" So every day after that, they would drive him up by, Hayagriva would drive him with a Volkswagen. And then there was Janmastami. And I remember Janmastami night, Radha Vrindavan Chandra was being moved into a new temple in which the devotees had just built. And there was about a month's worth of work to be done that day, as often devotees' time schedules create. So devotees were working frantically because at a certain hour Prabhupada was going to come to see the deities, Radha Vrindavan Chandra, in their new temple. So just as Prabhupada was walking in, one door, ladders and buckets were running out the Pujari room door. And when Prabhupada came, everything was perfect. Everything was complete. But the walls had just been painted. We were all praying that Prabhupada wouldn't touch the walls. So he came in and he saw the beauty of Radha Vrindavan Chandra. And he was looking at them. And he actually had tears in his eyes as he was just glancing upon the beauty of Radha Vrindavan Chandra and the wonderful worship that the devotees were offering. And Srila Prabhupada spoke to us. And he said that your Radha Vrindavan Chandra are most beautiful. They have appeared before you just like the most beautiful American boy and girl, just to attract your hearts. And then he said, your worship is very beautiful. He said, but be very careful. There are two paths on the path of bhakti. There is Pancharatraki Vidhi and there is Bhagavad Dharma. Pancharatraki Vidhi means worshipping the deity with great devotion and performing all services for the pleasure of the deity. And Bhagavad Dharma means hearing and chanting the glories of the Lord. He said they are like two rails on the same train track. They must go together. He said if you are not attentively hearing Srimad Bhagavatam and chanting the holy names every day, he said the day will come when you look at Radha Vrindavan Chandra and you will think, why has my Guru Maharaj left me with this burden? His words seared into our hearts. And I remember from that day on, the sadhana of the devotees at New Vrindavan was so incredibly strict. So strict. Devotees were getting up at 2 in the morning to chant their rounds. Everyone was there for Srimad Bhagavatam class. Prabhupada inspired that. And after the kirtan and I believe after the arti, Srila Prabhupada told the devotees to read Krishna book. It was a small temple, and it was completely overcrowded with devotees. And I remember the deities were in the front, Prabhupada was in the back of the temple, and there was an aisleway between that was left open. And along the two sides of the aisle were the sannyasis. All the sannyasis of North America were there sitting, facing each other with their dandas in their hands. And behind them was just devotees crowded so tight. And the sannyasis started to read. By this time it was very late at night, and it was very hot, and you could hardly breathe in that temple. And Srila Prabhupada was sitting on his Vyasasana with his back erect, listening attentively to Krishna's Leela. And everyone in the temple room was so exhausted, we were falling asleep. Literally, people were falling down and being caught by each other. And I'll never forget the sight, because I was new within ISKCON at this time, that the sannyasis were all sitting, and they all kept falling asleep. And they were holding their dandas, and you would just see their dandas going like this. Dandas were going like this and up. Nobody could stay awake in the whole temple room. But Prabhupada was sitting with his back straight, attentively hearing the glories of Lord Krishna. And when the first chapter was ended, the devotee read, "Thus ends the first chapter of Krishna book, entitled, I think, The Advent of Lord Krishna." And everyone, when they heard that the chapter ended, they were so happy. They chanted, "Jai Srila Prabhupada!" Not because of the book, but because it was over. And Srila Prabhupada sat with complete gravity and said, "Next chapter." And then they started reading the next chapter. And the devotees, the sannyasis were falling asleep, the devotees, everyone was just struggling and straining. Plus we fasted all day. Besides being tired, we were very hungry. It was way after midnight by this time. And the second chapter, I think it's the prayers of the demigods in the womb. It was a long, long chapter. And it seemed like hours and hours. And then the devotee read, "Thus ends the second chapter of Krishna book, entitled The Prayers by the Demigods to Krishna in the Womb." And everyone was so happy that it was over, thinking in terms of prasad and sleep. They chanted, "Jai Prabhupada!" And Prabhupada was sitting. Next chapter. He started reading the next chapter. And when I was watching him, I was thinking of Maharaj Parikshit. How Maharaj Parikshit was sitting for 7 days and 7 nights, rapt attention, just hearing the glories of the Lord, tasting the sweetness of the ambrosia. And it says in Srimad Bhagavatam that this is really the sign of a great soul, as he has such a taste to hear Krishna's glories. And I was watching all of us. We were struggling and straining, falling asleep, falling down, praying that the reading would end. And Prabhupada was sitting there, completely immersed in the ecstasy of hearing Krishna's Leela. And then the next chapter ended, and by that time the devotees hardly were able to even say, "Jai Prabhupada." And then Srila Prabhupada looked at all of us. We were pathetic. And he just smiled. He was still sitting erect, completely immersed in Krishna's Leela. And he said to us that, "I think that you are all very tired and hungry, so we will end here." And then everybody, as loud as you could imagine, chanted, "Jai Prabhupada!" And Srila Prabhupada was very happy just to see all of us together at New Vrindavan. You came to New Vrindavan, and I was given charge of garlanding Prabhupada, which was a very special service. When Srila Prabhupada first arrived, the plan was he was going to be escorted into the temple, and then when he sits on his Vyasasana, I was to greet him by putting the garland around his neck. So because of that, I got to be right there when Prabhupada came out of his car. It was a Lincoln Continental, and I had a tray with Prabhupada's garland on it. And everybody was pushing to be with Prabhupada. But because I had his garland, I was allowed to walk right behind him. immediately almost to the side and behind him. So I walked into the temple and Srila Prabhupada bowed down before Radha Vrindavan Chandra. And with great, great emotion, he just stared at the deities for about a minute or two. And then he went back and sat on the Vyasa-san. And by that time, all the devotees were crowded in the temple room, and the kirtan was going on. And I had the garland, and I approached Srila Prabhupada. And Srila Prabhupada looked at me, and he smiled. And then he bent his head down for me to put the garland on him. But I felt so shy that I didn't put the garland on him. So Prabhupada was looking at me like this, like, put it. And I was just standing there. And Prabhupada was saying, he didn't say anything, but with his eyes, he says so many things. So one of my sannyasi godbrothers was standing next to me. At that time I was a brahmachari. So I gave the garland to this godbrother of mine, and the godbrother put the garland on Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada didn't even look at my godbrother. He was just looking at me. And he was so pleased. He nodded his head like, yes, this is correct. You have understood. He didn't say anything, but through his gesture and through his eyes, he spoke in such a way that I could understand. He was saying, yes, to be the servant of my servant is the best way to please me. And that was one of the most wonderful instructions Srila Prabhupada ever gave me. And I'm, with my life and soul, endeavoring to try to follow that instruction. I remember one of my godbrothers, I believe it was Advaitacharya, he was asking Prabhupada about Siddha Deha. And in the middle of the sentence, as soon as he said the word Siddha Deha, Prabhupada cut him off. He said, what is this nonsense talking Siddha Deha? You are filled with so many bad qualities. He said, don't talk about Siddha Deha. And he explained, first you purify yourself through chanting Harinam. First you purify yourself by following the regulative principles. First you purify yourself by practicing the basic principles of Krishna consciousness. Until you're purified, don't talk about Siddha Deha. He was very strong, like a lion. Another devotee was talking about what if after taking initiation you fall down. Srila Prabhupada, again like a lion, he said, what is this fall down? There is no question of fall down. You have taken a vow in front of your spiritual master, in front of the deities, in front of the sacred fire, in front of the assembly of Vaishnavas. You have made your promise. How can you break your promise? No gentleman will break such a promise. There is no question of falling down. Another devotee named Janardhan, he asked Srila Prabhupada that sometimes people say that I don't need a guru because Krishna speaks to me within my heart. God speaks to me within the heart. What do we say to such a person? Prabhupada became very grave and very, very much heavy. He said, you don't know how to answer this question? You don't read my books? Why you rascal? Why you cannot answer this question? And he started chastising Janardhan severely. And then he explained the answer. That Krishna says in Bhagavad-gita, Tesham satata yuktanam bhajatam priti puravakam, dadami buddhi yogam tam yena mam upayantate. That only one who worships Krishna with complete devotion and does not fall down in any circumstance, only to such a person does Krishna speak within. Constantly serving me with love. He said, why don't you answer this? Why you don't know this verse? And he just went on and on and on, chastising Janardhan. And he was so heavy that everybody was like paralyzed. They just couldn't cope with Prabhupada's anger. And one devotee named Kula Shekhar, he asked Prabhupada a simple question to try to change the subject. And after he asked the question, Prabhupada just went back to Janardhan and continued to chastise him. He said, you are a rascal. He said, you have simply come to give me disturbance. In this way, Srila Prabhupada really seriously stressed to all of us how we should learn his books and be able to preach according to his books. That he had given so much of his life and his energy to write these books for us. That he speaks through his books. We don't have to ask him all these things personally. That was the lesson that I believe he was trying to teach us on that day. Every day, I lived in the old Vrindavan farm, which was on the other side of the mountain. And I had to go all the way, every evening to see Srila Prabhupada, I had to climb down, because I was Pujari, I had to climb down a mountain, across a small river, and then climb up a mountain, and then come to Prabhupada. Every day, as I was climbing up, there was a rose bush. And one beautiful, fully blossomed rose would be there every day. It was like a miracle. And I would pick that rose and I would always bring it. And when I would come, when Srila Prabhupada would sit on his Vyasasana, I would offer that rose at his lotus feet. And oftentimes, when he would be lecturing, he would pick up that rose and just hold it in his hand. And I remember one day, he was holding that rose I offered him, and he was smelling it, and he was looking at it, and he gave an example. He said, just like this rose is a flower, he had a garland of marigolds. He said, these are also flowers. He says, but still, this is a rose. Although they are both flowers, still the rose is the best of flowers. And he said, similarly, we are all simultaneously one and different than Krishna. Although we are one with Krishna, still Krishna is Krishna. Krishna is the rose. He gives this example of Achintya Bheda Bheda Shakti, Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva. Another time, I remember during those evening darshans, I was feeling a little guilty because I had lost my counting beads. And I was chanting my 16 rounds. And in New Vrindavan in those days, it was not easy to get counting beads or anything. So I was chanting my 16 rounds, but on that particular day, the only day I can ever remember in my life at that point, that I wasn't sure whether I finished my rounds or not. So as I was sitting just a few feet from Srila Prabhupada's Vyasasana, the thought came to my mind that I'm not sure whether I finished my rounds today. Just when I thought that, Srila Prabhupada looked right at me. He just stared at me very sincerely. Because during the darshan, when he wasn't talking to people, he'd be chanting japa. He looked at me and he held up his bead bag and he took one of his counting beads and very meticulously and slowly and deliberately, he pulled it down like this and then went like, and he was looking at me right at that time, and I was thinking, Srila Prabhupada wants me to get counting beads. Srila Prabhupada wants to make absolutely sure that there can be no compromise, that we properly chant our 16 rounds every day. One evening, devotees assembled for the night darshan, and it was very cold and it was raining that night. And Srila Prabhupada's secretary, who was then Pushta Krishna Maharaj, he came out and he told us that Srila Prabhupada will not be giving darshan tonight. We were all gathered at the front door of the house. And we were very sad that we wouldn't be able to have Srila Prabhupada's most precious association that night. So we all started walking away. And somehow Prabhupada, through another window in the house, saw how despondent we were when we were walking away. So he told Pushta Krishna that called him in, because usually he was outside. So he called us and said, Srila Prabhupada wants you to come in, he'll give you darshan. So we all came into this living room, we were all crowded in, and we were sitting down. And then Srila Prabhupada came out, and he was very, very ill that night. He just sat with his hand in his head like this. And he asked Pradyumna to read from Srimad Bhagavatam, 12th canto, about the symptoms of Kali Yuga. And it was announced that he would not speak that night. We would just be able to sit with him and hear Srimad Bhagavatam. So Pradyumna started to read some of the symptoms of Kali Yuga. And Prabhupada was sitting. And I remember he became so enlivened to hear Vedavyasa's descriptions of what will come in Kali Yuga that every time he read a symptom, Srila Prabhupada, he just all of a sudden became free of all of his sickness and dynamic and full of joy. He began to explain. Like I remember he said, people will travel long, long places just to go to a place of pilgrimage. This is a symptom of Kali. And Prabhupada said, yes, just like today. People are living in Calcutta, and they are on the bank of the Ganges, and they will go through so much trouble to go all the way to Hardwar just to bathe in the Ganges. He said, similarly, you are in New Vrindavan. New Vrindavan is non-different than Vrindavan. He said, you have no need to go anywhere. Vrindavan is here and Krishna is here. And all of the devotees became very happy. And then they read Pradyumna read about how a symptom of Kali beauty will be seen by how long one grows his hair. And Prabhupada said, yes, you see, Vedavyas, he could see past, present, and future. He said at the time when he wrote this Srimad Bhagavatam, there was no hippie movement, but he knew the hippie movement would come. And then he began to explain how Srimad Bhagavatam was the perfect scripture, because it was written by Vedavyas, who had perfect realization and who had perfect vision of past, present, and future, and perfect vision of Krishna. So in this way, what originally appeared to be a very despondent night of just going away without Prabhupada became the most wonderful of all the darshans. Toward the beginning of his visit, the weather became quite cold and rainy. And Srila Prabhupada decided he should leave New Vrindavan because it wasn't very suitable to his health. So his secretary told that Srila Prabhupada's going to be cutting his trip here short because the weather here does not agree with him. At that time, Kirtanananda Swami became very sad, and he told Srila Prabhupada that if this place is not suitable for you to live happily, then we will just leave this place and sell it and start New Vrindavan somewhere else. And I'll never forget Srila Prabhupada's reply. He said, no. He said, because you are protecting Krishna's cows here, your mission is perfect. It is a success. And then he said, I will stay until the end of my scheduled visit. One night, when it was cold and raining, he was having a small darshan in his own little private bedroom or recording room where he would do his translations. And only about 15 devotees could fit. Now, I had a picture. I was the pujari of the Brahmachari's temple. It was Radha Vrindavanath's temple. And Srila Prabhupada was very merciful to me. I used to make sandesh every day. And Srila Prabhupada, whenever anyone from New Vrindavan would go to visit Prabhupada, they would always bring him a box of sandesh I made. And he, out of his great kindness, he always showed appreciation. And when he came to New Vrindavan, he told me that he wanted me to make sandesh for him for every meal, 3 times a day. So on this one particular night, I came with a picture of the deities from the Brahmachari ashram, Radha Vrindavanath, because Kirtanananda Swami decided that Srila Prabhupada should not go there because the road was too treacherous and because the ashram was so primitive and there was no modern anything there. He thought it would be an inconvenience for Prabhupada. So I was thinking as pujari, if he's not going to come to see the deities, at least the deities could come to see him. So I came with a photo. And Pushta Krishna was not allowing anyone in his room, but I said, I have a gift for Prabhupada. So he said, all right, you come in. So I came in and I offered this picture of Radha Vrindavana, the only photo we had of those deities. And Prabhupada looked at it, and he was so happy. As he looked at it, he asked Kirtanananda Swami, is this Radha Vrindavan Chandra? He said, no, this is Radha Vrindavanath, and this is the boy who always makes sandesh for you. And, and Srila Prabhupada was looking at the picture, and he began to just talk about Vrindavan. And then he said, you will take me there? And Kirtanananda Swami said, no, Prabhupada, the road is very bad. It is very difficult to get up there. And Prabhupada said, you have pickup, jeep? We will go. I want to go. So Prabhupada intervened with all the cancellations of his trip there, and he insisted that he go. So they took him by a jeep part of the way, and then the rest of the way would be his morning walk. As he was walking, there were cows in the pasture, and the original cow of ISKCON, her name was Kalia. She was a very small black Jersey. At that time she was very old. When she saw Srila Prabhupada, she ran to him. This is the first cow of our movement, and Prabhupada personally named her Kalia. 8 years later, he had never seen her since 1968 when he first came to New Vrindavan. When the cow came running up, one devotee said, Prabhupada, this is a very special cow. And Prabhupada said, yes, I know, this is Kalia. And Kalia walked beside Prabhupada for the morning walk. Prabhupada was so encouraging. He was so encouraging. He would do anything to try to increase a devotee's enthusiasm for devotional service. One time when he was eating the sandesh I prepared for him, he said that this is the best sandesh I have ever tasted in my entire life. And somebody from some other place brought him sandesh, another occasion, and he ate it. And the person who brought it said, do you like this sandesh? He said, it is very good, but it is not as good as Radhanatha's. So in this way he would say whatever it took to enliven us and invoke a desire to serve him and serve Krishna. Another time, one devotee named Taru made sweet rice, and Prabhupada tasted the sweet rice at New Vrindavan, and he said that I have not tasted sweet rice so good in 40 years. Another time, Chandramali Swami, he made pera for Srila Prabhupada, and Prabhupada liked it so much. He said he has not tasted pera like this for so many years. He said, please give this to me with all my meals. And when Srila Prabhupada would give cookies to the children during Guru Puja, it was a wonderful thing, because I was thinking that this is a real preacher. The children couldn't understand philosophy. They weren't able to follow the Srimad Bhagavatam class. But Srila Prabhupada knew if they just became attached to him, they would go back to Godhead. So with a beautiful, loving smile, like a father, he would give each child a cookie, and the children just loved Prabhupada. Everything he did was to induce our love for him, because he knew that our love for him was being carried to the lotus feet of Radha and Krishna. The depths of Srila Prabhupada's compassion was something that invoked a mood of surrender from my heart. How much he was willing to extend himself and sacrifice of himself to give us Krishna consciousness. He was so learned that whatever he spoke was just purely presenting the absolute truth in toto. That everything was included in every word he spoke. That the compassion and the concern and the love he had for conditioned souls was something that I had never seen before. I lived with several of his godbrothers who were also extremely learned. They knew the Shastra. It appeared as he knew the Shastra. But Srila Prabhupada's deep, deep, merciful nature to give his life for us was something that I had never experienced before anywhere, in anyone.